opening address from our keynote speaker, Cristina Pacione-Zayas, and she's here joining us again for our panel discussion. And for those who are in the Zoom audience here, we have 4 alum who will be answering some questions as they were drafted for this panel and moderation about education in the pandemic. Our first alum is Dr. Megan Bates, and she's the director of the Illinois Workforce and Education Research Collaborative, hosted by the Discovery Partners Institute, better known as DPI. And Dr. Bates earned her degrees, MA and PhD in educational psychology. And if I remember correct, you got your BA in secondary English. Is that correct? All right, excellent. See, there's a historian coming out of me in that regard. So welcome. Second speaker is Dr. Dawn Williams. She's the Dean of Howard University. My son just did a virtual tour of Howard and liked it a lot. So I was like, wow, I can't believe, I know. Allie's like, wait a minute, he was in my elementary school. So now he's thinking about college in this sense. But she's with us and joining us in that regard. Our third, she earned her degrees. Let me back up here. Both her master and PhD in educational policy studies, and her BS is from North Carolina A&T State University. Our third speaker is Dr. Alicia Lewis. She's our director of the University Primary School. And it's the College of Education Laboratory School that goes from preschool through 5th grade. Dr. Lewis, is a graduate of Education Policy Studies, if I'm not mistaken, and Curriculum Instruction, or is it just EPS? Just EPS. But curriculum instruction is always near and dear to her heart in that regard. And our fourth speaker is, again, our keynote speaker, Senator Cristina Pacione-Zayas. And again, we had an introduction for her this morning, but just to rehash, recently appointed Illinois State Senator as of December 2020. She is EPS graduate as well. And if I don't know if I remember this correctly, where did you did your undergraduate work here?
Everything.
She did everything here. She's a crisp span, did all her degrees here, and now just waiting to take my job. In essence. So that being said, I'm going to serve as the moderator of this discussion for these 4 panelists. We've prepared a couple questions for them, roughly 4 questions. We're going to ask each panelist to kind of think a little bit about those questions in their own right as we go through the process of asking them. And our goal is to leave some time for the audience to be able to ask questions to the panelists. I am aware that one of our panelists, Meg Bates, she does have a Zoom conflict at 1 o'clock. It's going to leave just a little bit early. So if she pops off early, hopefully it's because it's that meeting and not, I was joking when it happened in our keynote this morning that it was the Zoom man trying to keep us down. So hopefully it's not the Zoom man trying to keep us down in this regard. But why don't we jump right into this conversation? What I'm hoping is maybe each of the panelists take a couple minutes to offer maybe a little bit more description of themselves if they like, but just as important, answer the question around what's happening right now. We know COVID has impacted everyone. And as a person responsible for so many different considerations in your profile, what strategies have you employed to ensure best practices and outcomes for the constituents and people you serve? And so I was wondering maybe if we can begin with Christina, Dr. Pacione-Zayas for that consideration.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And this is just such an amazing panel. Really excited to be in community with you all. I think, personally, there's 3 things that I've really come to just anchor myself in. One is you got to accept that you're not in control. There has been so much out of control during this pandemic, and I think you will continue to just be incredibly frustrated and disappointed if you do not allow for that acceptance. I think the other thing to acknowledge is that productivity looks different. We cannot expect to produce in the same way, not only in volume, but in quality. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's worse. It just means that it's different. And we have to embrace that. And then I think the third area is really grace, for yourself and for others in this process. Because I think if anything, we are reminded of our humanity. We are reminded of, the pain and suffering that so many members in our communities are experiencing. And, I think we just need to kind of have some grace about that. And so in terms of the strategies with ensuring best practices and outcomes, I think this is an opportunity to really anchor and root yourself in community. This is one of the areas that I've really been thinking about deeply, and I just launched actually today a stakeholder strategy in the 20th Legislative District to make sure that the legislation that I support, that I develop, that I advance is anchored in the lived experience and the expertise of the constituents who both live and work within the 20th Legislative District. I have a roundtable strategy that these individuals are going to help me refine my policy priorities. They're going to help me review bills together. And then when appropriate, we're going to co-author some legislation. So my objective is to not only be anchored in their priorities and lived experience and expertise, but also to invite them into the process. And so the kind of blessing that the pandemic has offered is that, as frustrating as the virtual environment may be, it does afford some access that has not been afforded historically. It doesn't mean that we're covering all the bases, right? I still got to be in the streets. I still need to go stomp the ground and knock on doors and, meet people and bring them in. But this has been another way that I've been able to kind of base build to really tackle some of these problems.
No, thank you. Dean Williams, thoughts on this?
Good afternoon again. I'm Dawn Williams, as Dr. Span has mentioned, and a proud alumna of the College of Education, and so happy to be back even in this virtual space to interact with students and also fellow panelists. I'm so happy that the panel, as we're talking about COVID, is one that is representative, particularly in the area of K-12 education and higher education, also in government, because it is these entities that are going to have to work together to get us through this. Now, speaking on the higher education side, because I'm in higher education, but higher education within largely education, we have to keep our eye on what's going on in K through 12, but then also have to understand how to apply that in adult education within higher education. So this pandemic has been a challenge on so many different levels. I want to further emphasize what the senator, and I'm so happy to keep saying that, what the senator has said in her remarks about this whole notion of community. So even myself as an educator, but then also a parent of a young one who is a first grader, I have found myself reminiscing of when I was a teacher and understanding all that we have to go through as educators to make sure that our students are learning, but then also adding another layer of understanding what our teachers are going through, as well as leaders, but particularly what our teachers are going through right now to try to impart that wisdom and education on students within a virtual setting, which is so new. So here I'm in my home office. My son generally sits right on the other side of me. So I feel like I'm in first grade as well. And with that being said, it was very rocky at the beginning of the academic year and also rocky at the end of last academic year. And what I had to find myself doing is when I'm writing the email to the teacher, to say, oh, have you thought about this? Or where just trying to be sensitive that I am a higher educator who is also a former teacher, but I'm also a parent. So when I advocate for my child, I'm really advocating for all children. And that is so important for us to do that in this realm of community that the senator talked about, of working together in that regard. The the benefits that we have seen through COVID-19 has been helping us to uncover much of the disparities that have already exist that really became exacerbated during the widening of the pandemic. But what I see as somewhat of a silver lining is now that education has taken a spotlight like we have never seen it before. So this is something that we are all paying attention to. And I often, when I'm talking with other agencies, to tell them this is the time that you really need to put your advocacy in full force because you have the ear of American citizens right now. Parents are understanding how hard it is to educate children because they're being partners in that education right now. There's a level of understanding and also a larger level of appreciation of what happens within schools now that many children are primarily at home during this pandemic. So this is the time that we must band together to be able to advocate for greater support to education. I think we have a better idea of what that support should look like within these days. So I'll leave it there for now, but just to a greater emphasis on the advocacy, but doing it from a communal perspective and not just one part of the system leading that advocacy.
Again, deeply appreciative of the comments. Dr. Lewis, how would your pre-K through fifth graders help you answer that question?
That wasn't the original question posed to me how my kids would answer it, but I can pivot there, as we've gotten very good at this year. So just to give you a little perspective, I'm the principal of the school here on campus, preschool through fifth grade, and we normally have many college students coming into school, from practicum students to volunteers, not just from the College of Ed, it's featuring science and psychology and things like that. And so this is a really robust community in terms of ages and perspectives, maturities and development. And so right away, it's just such a different year. We're really missing those kinds of connections that we've had in the past. But through the remote and online platforms, we've been able to really reconnect and find that that is also meaningful. Though different, it's meaningful. And so I think what both of you have said, Senator and Dr. Williams, about community has been really on our hearts here, and making sure that the children also feel a part of the community, feel that their decisions are being considered, that their voice is being heard, that they feel that they have some choice in some of the matters, being in a position where they can say, I'm not feeling safe about, a certain aspect of their daily life. But there are a lot of have tos this year for kids. And we've been having school at school when we can, and we have school at home when we need to. And some of our families have elected to be home, because they have to, or because they want to, the whole year, even preschool families. So our teachers and our college students have really had to be in communication and had to stay connected in ways that we haven't had to in the past. And so I wanted to say that the College of Education and the university at large has really served in sort of that school board realm for me. So when I'm thinking about best practices, not making those decisions just by myself, obviously, but then Illinois Department of Public Health, CDC, they've given us such wonderful guidance. And fortunately, we're in a state where we're looking at the science. And so schools have been given a lot of clear direction about how to do school as far as safety goes. But each one of our decisions this year, I think, relates to best practice in that we are looking at basically two filters: the filter of health and safety, and the filter of well-being and choice. And I want to say strongly that that filter goes all the way down to a 3-year-old, and that a 3-year-old has a right to safety and health, and that a 3-year-old has a right to well-being and choice, just like the 33, 43, 53-year-old. So thank you.
Meg, what additional thoughts or considerations do you have on the question? Dr.
Yeah.
Bates, sorry.
No, absolutely. So first, I would say it is such an honor to be on a panel with such accomplished women. And I really, I echo a lot of what's already been brought up. I mean, I think the number one thing that I've thought about a lot is, we know the ways that tech is exclusive and keeping people out of kind of normal practice or previous practice in terms of community and participating in their work. I like to think about, where has tech been inclusive? Where has it changed who can participate, on what grounds they can participate, how much they can? And, as both, an educational researcher, but also as a parent, I think that tech has opened up school board meetings to more people, has opened up communications with teachers to more people, has made teachers in some ways more attentive to their email communications with parents and their other ways of communicating. So I hope these are things that we don't lose, that we learn from and continue, and that we kind of catalog ways that tech made things easier. I mean, another example, I have a council of advisors for our research agenda at our unit at DPI. And so many folks that I've reached out to on that council have said, I never could have done this if you weren't holding these meetings on Zoom. I wouldn't have been able to travel. I wouldn't have been able to be part of this. So, thinking through that, I think, is very important. As just someone who's always, throughout my entire career, engaged in research practice partnerships, and had ongoing research practice partnerships in schools when this began last March. It's about adjusting your expectations. And then I think for participants in projects, for your partners in projects. And then I think it's also been a wonderful opportunity to rethink whether those expectations were ever correct to begin with. How can we think more deeply about how we engage people in research, in partnering, particularly people that are very busy in their school lives. So those are a couple of things that, I never want to be Pollyannish about what's going on right now and how terrible it's been for so many, but looking forward, what can we learn and how can we use what we learned to be more inclusive would be my message.
No, that's excellent. And it really opens up consideration for our second question. When we think of COVID, one thing it has done is expose and exacerbated many structural inequities in society and life. And all of you have already alluded to this, particularly in the K through 12 public system, in both the short term and the long term. And I'm opening this up to anybody who wants to comment here. How do we apply this understanding? And I know, Dr. Bates, you've already given some consideration to this, but how do we apply this understanding to our everyday lives to recalibrate? So we do begin the processes of developing a more just and equitable society.
I could hop in. I remember, in April of last year, it was the week before Chicago Public Schools was gonna kind of do their pseudo launch of remote learning. It was right after spring break, because we had kind of been in this limbo, right? And I just saw the writing on the wall, and I was just like, oh God, this is not going to be good. It's going to be a mess. And I was on the Illinois State Board of Education at the time. And, I just, in my observations and checking in with stakeholders and, hearing from families and community members, I wrote an open letter to the board. And I said, look, I think what we need to accept is that we're going to have massive disruption of in-person learning for at least 18 months. And if we accept that, and also operate under the assumption that our resources are going to be restricted, let's be judicious and strategic. And let's anchor our work in supporting schools to be distribution hubs for food, for learning resources, for referrals, for social service agencies, for really just doing all the things that they've been doing forever, but we never sourced them to do. And then let's go hard on wrapping around our educators in professional learning, because pedagogy as we know it is going to be changed forever. So let's really go deep into how they transition to remote teaching, because that's going to be in there some mix, whether it's a hybrid or whether it's fully remote. And let's also really equip them with the support around social emotional learning, development, so on and so forth. And the third area that I would recommend is let's get a little innovative. And there's a program called the Parent Mentor Program here in Illinois. And what it is basically a model of parental engagement and support within classrooms. In traditional times, it would be parents would actually kind of serve as classroom aides for educators from preschool all the way up through 12th grade. These tended to be parents who were moms, who were immigrants, so they come with language assets. They were able to support our dual language learners. They come from the community, so on and so forth. And they got approval from the state board to modify their plan to become mobile parent mentors. So they were able to then be distribution points and bring supplies to families who were not connected and help connect them to resources. And so it was innovative. And I said, let's go hard on this, as opposed to saying, okay, in about 2 months, we'll be back to normal. We'll be back in the classrooms, and you get everybody amped up and they get their plans together, and then bam, we're back in stay-at-home order. You know, so it's all this start, stop that we were not able to make any kind of progress. And so that was the immediate, the short term that I was suggesting. Interestingly, I did not get a response from anybody. And that's when I had to call up the chair and said, look, you don't have to agree with me, but what you're not going to do is ignore me. And then I started to get into, let's think about the long-term strategy. So while we're dealing with the emergency, let's also do some work groups about how we can reconfigure, reimagine education because of that whole issue around pedagogy. And what are we learning right now that we're going to continue to build upon and examine and support and build out? And so, you know, those were some of my suggestions. And I worked closely with Chicago Public Schools, particularly about how they were doing remote learning with young children, because it was completely developmentally inappropriate. We were in school from 9 a.m. online all the way until 3:40 p.m. It blew my mind that they thought that that was okay. And yes, you have a couple breaks here and there, but please try to explain that to a kindergartner. That's the antithesis of child development science. And so I worked really closely with the chief education officer to develop a virtual community of practice for our early childhood educators, for them to share with each other strategies that are working in the remote setting, for them to be experts in their own practice and allow that space for them to give to each other these tips, these strategies, and to learn in real time together. And so I think that there's some great opportunities for us to facilitate those types of innovations and think about how we carry that forward in the long term as we kind of reconceptualize schooling.
Others? That's a tough act to follow, by the way.
Certainly is, but I'll attempt to add a couple of more words there, particularly as we are talking about reconceptualizing what it's going to look like post-COVID. We're in the right place to talk about that, because much of what we learn comes from research. So universities help to lead that kind of work, to look at what has been implemented and what has actually worked in particular settings, and learning about that, writing about it, but writing about it in places where it will be received in ways that it would be understood to better implement. Dr. Bates talked earlier about public-private partnerships. We are seeing that now, and that's again talking about the larger goal of community coming together again. T-Mobile is a good example of that, where they provide hotspots for children who are having connectivity issues during the virtual learning. But right now, this is such a major challenge for leaders. And so, Principal Lewis, I give huge kudos to the work that you all do with having to make these kinds of decisions during this time, because it's like solving a problem that's on a moving target. We want to say, oh, until this date, and then that date nears and we have to say something else. So it is very hard for leaders to come together, leaders within higher education, dealing with their student population, as well as leaders, particularly within the K-12 space. But going back to that public-private partnership and really advocating for community to work together and seeking out those opportunities where even within the philanthropic world that they are willing to work within a public setting to be able to advance what is the innovation that's needed. It is going to look different post-COVID. We're going to see a lot more, I believe. We're going to see a lot more of what we're seeing now, but sort of a mixture or lack of a better term, a hybrid of implementation of what learning is going to look like within K-12 and then also beyond with higher education. Students will have more opportunities to be engaged in a virtual setting, which there's good and bad attached to that if the appropriate mix is not considered. But the opportunity for our children to connect with people around the world is a good thing within virtual learning. Seeing Senator just talked about developmental as it relates to early learners. I am always surprised on my first grader being able to log into the computer, pressing Control Alt and Delete at the same time and remembering the password to get into the computer. And I just happened to see him do it one day, and I didn't teach him. He just kept watching me do it. And he knew how to do it when he needed to get into a particular class. So I think it is also advancing the technological skill set for our youngsters. They're exposed to much more than what they had even a year and a half ago of what they're able to do from a technology perspective.
Anyone else?
I'll just reiterate just a little bit from the preschool through fifth grade setting, just the importance that our most vulnerable voices be able to be heard, and that children and teachers and families are able to be seen. And that difference, I think, in this setting is able to be seen and talked about rather than not talking about difference, whether that's racial difference, language difference, family culture, personalities, health needs. I mean, all of these aspects of difference, we can't just apply a one size fits all in education, and we shouldn't be doing that. We know that that's not developmentally appropriate. And we really need to be looking at investing in the social emotional as well as the academic and intellectual. And that's going to take a lot of strong leadership. The children are always trying to get teachers and families and the grown-ups to understand this. They need more than just information delivered to them. They need to be active participants, and they are eager to participate. They're so eager that they want to wear the mask. They want to say, I'm important too. And so I just want to, stand in a place of like ally with the children that are in my my community to just really help lift their voices up, because as young people, they're not often listened to. So recognizing difference, recognizing the different identities that children come to us online and in person. Our teachers in March, they said they're seeing a whole new side of some of their students. The kid that was the most talkative in class and the most engaged in class is very, very quiet on Zoom, and flip for some other children. So that's a really big understanding to come to. And then how do we bring out those strengths and those challenges in both kinds of settings? So.
And Dr. Bates?
Yeah, no, the only thing I would add, and these are really wonderful perspectives. I've just been thinking a lot about how America in general, we're very oriented to solve problems individually or from our own corner of the world. And I think what this crisis has shown us is the limitations of that kind of thinking, and that problems are solved collectively. And it's been, I think, an informative and beautiful thing to see so many mutual aid groups and community groups pop up during this and work to better understand communities and what's going on and what people's needs are. And so when I was thinking about this question, I just took it a little bit broader as, I don't think we'll be able to change educational systems until all of the players in the system, parents, policymakers, researchers, whoever, start advocating for the collective rather than for their own piece of the world. And I've seen a lot of this, again, my perspective is always colored by being a parent and seeing people in our community that are advocating for the schools being open or not based on their one child or their two children, and not advocating based on an understanding of the broader community and what the broader needs are, and the different perspectives. And so I hope, and I think in some ways this crisis could push us to actually go out in the world, understand our friends and neighbors, understand different needs, and stop advocating for our own needs and concerns above the collective needs.
Well, these are all excellent points. And you think about a word like they say we want to return to normalcy, but whose normalcy, right? It's like we got so many different layers and considerations and perspectives of normal, and some normals were pretty abnormal, if we think about how society has exposed that. But yeah, all of these points are excellent. I know we're at the halfway point here and we got a couple questions left, but one in particular is that we've really come to learn, our graduate students are coming to learn that teaching, research, service, they're pretty much the bedrock of an academician's professional life. And yet COVID has disrupted that reality. So as they're trying to draft their dissertations or to teach or to engage in some public service or engagement, all of these things have been either disrupted or upended. And nonetheless, it has forced us, as many of you have said, to rethink strategies and develop new innovations to achieve best outcomes. I was wondering if you can continue to share just a little bit, if you think about that element, like we have a person who's at the think tank with Erickson, we have a dean who's probably looking at faculty like, faculty saying, what do I do in this moment? We got someone who's working with great partnerships between institutions of higher education and communities. And we also got a principal who's trying to navigate all of these worlds here. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit of how there is an opportunity here for us to develop a new generation of academicians, a new generation of educators to reimagine higher education, or at least our role within it. And I was wondering if I could get you to speak a little bit about that consideration as well.
So I don't mind starting. So for this one, I think one thing I've been thinking about a lot in light of, how we reimagine, how we train graduate students, what we do as researchers. I think we really need to be just much more interdisciplinary. I mean, I think what we have seen is you can't separate, like race and gender studies from education, from economics, from public policy. They are all intertwined. We need to construct more projects to have more voices in the room and more diversity of voices in terms of disciplinary background and other forms of diversity as well. I also have been thinking a lot as a researcher about how we define our outcomes, and that we tend to rely on outcomes that are tried and true, and we know that certain policymakers value. And it's really, I really think we're at a pivot point where we need to start letting communities define outcomes. And broadly speaking, so what are the right outcomes for a particular community, for students, parents, educators, and redefine that a bit. And I actually think there's really good work going on around that. And I think we're always going to be beholden to worrying about outcomes that are necessary for certain funding opportunities or for certain policymakers. But I think we do need to re-envision outcomes as coming from the people being served.
Others?
I'll continue a little bit on that thread around interdisciplinary work, not just in teaching, as we have seen, but then also in the area of research. But I want to push it a little bit further and think about how do we even approach or view problems, because it's the problem that brings us to the research to want to find out more information. And we tend to think of problems many times, and I'm going to reference communities that have been largely underserved, but we tend to think of problems many times, and we problematize the communities instead of the system. So if students aren't performing at a certain rate, it is largely compared to the majority population, but also in addition to that, it's like, why aren't Black students learning or graduating from high school, as an example, is a very common question that is often posed. And the study of that tends to look at what the environmental context around the underrepresented students instead of the system that regulates it. And having more of that systems approach is probably where the major questions should be asked, especially when we have seen patterns, we've seen trends, and we've seen decades and centuries of these disparities that exist. Those disparities that exist are not individual based. It is an outcome of the system that has produced it. So even when we look at we have to challenge the rules, because the rules are what is kind of the undergirding of the system, and see what's there that are causing some of the outcomes that we see. So I think approaches like that really lend themselves well to interdisciplinary collaborations, to having those sociologists and the psychologists, along with the educators, having the people in STEM and people in learning sciences, et cetera, having people who study organizations as a part of getting to really more of the nucleus of some of these bigger problems. So that's what I would highly encourage. And because we have graduate students on the line who are always looking at what that dissertation proposal is going to compose of, I want to challenge you to think a little bit past the problematizing, because you can be attracted to that because we read so much of it. But to move past that, to look more from an organizational structure of what could be the role that's being played that is causing some of the outcomes that we have seen.
I'm going to pick up from there. That was the two amazing. Okay. I'd like to just add a little bit about the outcome piece, because, you know, as Dr. Williams had just alluded to, you know, the system is designed to produce the exact outcomes we witness on a regular basis, particularly when we look at data disaggregated by race, ethnicity, even when we look at it through a geographic lens or the intersectional lens, right? And I think I want to share with you all some treats, you know, to kind of build on what Dean Williams was saying, and to go beyond the problematization and to really start to grapple with the systems and structures. You know, the University of Illinois is a system, right? It is entrenched in a lot of what we speak to with respect to what can be problematic in society, and reproducing racialized hierarchies and anchoring in white supremacy. And so one of the treats that I'm putting in the chat is, I constantly reference this in a lot of the work that I'm doing, and we were actually in the process of applying this framework, several of them at Erickson, around white supremacist cultural characteristics. How do they show up? How do they manifest in very concrete ways? And then what are the ways that we can disrupt, transform, right? And we know in the academic space, there is a worship of the written word. There is a culture that you are supposed to adopt in terms of decorum and what is appropriate and what is considered knowledge. right? And so all of that particular list really, gets your mind kind of going to say, okay, how am I actually an agent of this? Because as radical as I am, I live in a white supremacist society. And if I am comfortable, that means I'm upholding it. So I need to get real uncomfortable all the time. And so it's really about, how do we bring these tools into the work that we're doing when we are in positions of leadership, when we are not in positions of leadership, but when there are power dynamics, and what position are we taking to really transform those particular dynamics? The second treat that I put in the chat is a great toolkit about how to actually engage in that work in your work settings, whether it's an institution of higher ed, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a nonprofit. It talks about the 3 stages of development, from awake to woke to work. And it gives you real concrete ways that you can assess your setting, your environment, what you have control over, what you don't have control over, and how you begin to go from awakening to being woke to actually doing the work, and how you can kind of measure those benchmarks, and what roles each of the kind of different classifications of individuals within those systems can operationalize this framework. And then the last piece is on the research tip. There's a presentation that a colleague and I have been doing across the country. It's called Decolonizing Language, and how when we decolonize language and data, it leads us to systemic solutions. And what it proposes is that there's 2 kind of bad actors in this research space, and even in the policy space as well. It's the use of labels. We get real lazy when we want to categorize people. Just the fact that we categorize that phrase, at risk. At risk what? Nobody was born at risk. It's not an intrinsic characteristic, right? But it slips off tongues. It's all over grant proposals. Foundations love it. It's used in the government. Even that term, low income. We put that as a descriptor of children, of families, of communities, and don't think anything twice about it. But what we don't do is center the onus on the system that creates the conditions and the limited access to economic and material resources for individuals to be able to live their best life, right? And so this particular presentation really starts to unpack that, and how we can look at data. And you have what you call individual level data, like test scores broken down by race, ethnicity, and basically all it does is reinforce that, we're not measuring up to whiteness. But you have structural data that begins to illuminate how the structures produce those outcomes. And it puts you back into the mindset of how we need to tackle the system, because it's going to continue to produce those outcomes. And how when we do, it's not to say individual level data is bad. It's okay. It's just that it requires a structural analysis so that we don't fall into the perpetuation of racialized stereotypes, the master narrative that we're deficient because we can't measure up to whiteness. And so those are things that I think that particularly in the academy, we need to contend with. And what I thoroughly appreciated about being in the EPS space, particularly taking critical race theory and, oh my God, space traders. You remember watching that video? That was everything. I use that all the time at Erickson. But it really helped to provide a framework and a language to then be able to tackle these discussions at the policy level, at the institutional level, and really grapple with it. But, I noticed not everybody had the benefit of being under Dr. Anderson and working closely with all the giants in EPS. So we kind of have to bring our colleagues along.
Dr. Lewis, anything to add?
Well, I had prepared some notes about innovations more close to home. But I just want to say, and it seems like a theme for me right now, and I shouldn't be surprised. But I feel that we often limit the competencies that the children have, And that because we have put ourselves in an online format for which the children often have greater competencies than adults, we have learned a lot from them, and they have felt some power that has really pushed teachers who maybe want all the control to invite a different kind of co-control or co-creation. Senator, you talked about different kinds of knowledges, and children's funds of knowledges have very much been validated in classrooms, online and in person, where teachers are looking past these only traditional ways of, I mean, you talked about outcomes, Dr. Bates, this is all here. And I think that one of the innovations that I think has been most meaningful has been through the technology to see the children and the teachers co-collaborate and discover and push themselves together when allowed. And that's where the inequities come out for teachers that have to have full control. You know, maybe children have never been able to be off of mute, for example. And looking at individual communities, I think, is really important, and making decisions as teachers and as families is really important. Our first week after we went into lockdown in March, we talked real hard the day before. Are we going to jump into Zoom? And what are we doing with preschool? And the teacher said, we're going to let them be unmuted and teach them how to use the mute unmute, because in real life, you don't get to push the mute button. And it's just been quite phenomenal to see the different innovations and to celebrate those. But there are deep inequities at work here. And those we need to keep talking about those differences and not let that conversation die out.
No, this is fantastic. I tell you, pearls of wisdom, and for the graduate students who are, hearing this phenomenal session, keep in mind, every person speaking was a graduate student, and so they just kept enhancing their understanding and thoughts on these matters and honing them to the point of not only being consumers of knowledge, but being the producers of the knowledge that you're hearing right now. So that's very, very important. Our last question, and I know for the sake of time, I'm gonna ask Dr. Bates to start us off here because she has to be somewhere else, is what advice would you give us as we navigate, particularly our graduate students, as they navigate their careers or the beginning of their careers amid this pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is advice I give a lot, not just in pandemic times, but I think it might be more relevant now. So prepare yourself for careers that might not be faculty, and be okay with that. There's no shame in finishing grad school and not taking a faculty position. It's really luck of the draw what's available when you're done. And I know just by the constitution of this panel, I think, the university is recognizing that, of course. But I just know how much anxiety there is as you finish up your graduate degree about your next steps, and that your next step is not going to be what defines you. It's really going to be what work you do and the sort of approach that you take to it. And so all of the things that we're talking about today will help shape you in that way.
Dean Williams?
Sure. As I'm in the midst of hiring for a couple of faculty positions right now, let me tell you what I look at when I'm looking at that CV, whether someone is fresh off of defending their dissertation or they're joining us from another university. It is the sort of the diversity of experiences that they have held. And I said I was going to try to remember to say this as I'm talking to graduate students today. So a graduate, when I was a graduate student, her name is Joy Williamson Lott. But one advice I remember her giving us as we were graduate students was saying that for now on, any job that you take while you're in graduate school needs to be connected to something that you would like to do. So she said, no more working at the Gap. No more working at restaurants, or, today is so different. It could be Uber, etc. But you want to make sure that you are exercising your talents and making sure that you're diversifying your experiences. So right now, that might look like that you would take up a part-time job of tutoring. That's still in the realm of education, and you're doing somebody a service by doing that, because there is a high need for co-curricular type of experiences for children right now. But I want to say the diversity of those experiences are very attractive to me when I have seen what kind of research that you have engaged in, what kind of service that you have engaged in. Because if you haven't had the opportunity to have full-time work, how you have served the community is major. So part of what Dr. Span started off this talk with was sort of that formula of teaching, research, and service. Does your service align with what your teaching and research says? How are they feeding each other? Um, so I'll leave it as that, with making sure that you have a range of diverse experiences when you are looking to approach any position. But particularly if you're looking to approach a faculty position, that is a very attractive type of vita to have, where I can see what you have done in the areas of research, teaching, and service in a number of different ways. It doesn't always have to be the traditional teaching has been with as a graduate assistant. It could be that you were a kindergarten teacher before you decided to go to graduate school, or doing it at the same time. That is also a very attractive trait for those who are coming into the higher education space, having an education background.
Dr. Lewis?
I was going to say, with the pandemic, often we feel very isolated. I think graduate school can feel very isolated at times. And so my advice would be to really take the initiative to stay in touch with your graduate colleagues. They all have different lenses and backgrounds. Hopefully you're in a diverse program, but stay in touch with them and work to form those relationships, because you can go back to those many, many years from now. Similarly, your professors, your mentors, try and stay in touch with them, bounce ideas off of them, put your face in front of them on Zoom. And then also, when you're in research spaces with practitioners or children or families, recognize that they also are your teachers too. Like, you're learning from them, and those relationships that you are forming with them are not just for your benefit. You should be benefiting them as well, and treat those folks as colleagues as well.
Dr. Senator Pacione-Zayas?
Those are all fabulous, because definitely I think what I would add on a practical tip, if you're able to try to connect every paper that you write to your dissertation topic, or the general topical area that you'll be doing your qualifying exams on, so you can kind of get a leg up and start to build that framework out. Somebody gave me that advice in the very beginning, and I'm telling you, that like saved my life. I think the other piece is, around, for sure, I knew coming in, although I probably didn't tell Dr. Anderson this, but I knew coming in I was not going to be faculty right away. That my objective was to get the training, get the experience, and come right back to the hood and apply it. So that, because I knew that, I did what Dawn suggested, and at a certain point, this was well before virtual, and online learning. There was this program called the Consortium for Institutional Cooperation, and you could take coursework at another institution, but still be a U of I student. As your home institution, you can go to a host institution. So, I was antsy to get out of Champaign. My research was in Chicago, after doing undergrad. So I made sure I took advantage of that. My last 2 semesters of coursework I did at UIC, And I started to reach out to my UVI network. And some of you all probably know Dr. David Stovall at UIC. I said, Dave, I need to get reconnected. Help me out with, you know, the landscape, the framework out here in terms of I need to be on the ground because I don't want to come out overqualified, underexperienced. And so I built, you know, my experience that way, even in a part-time capacity. And that was just so helpful because when I was done, the place that I was working part-time ended up hiring me full-time in a director position. I didn't have to wait, you know, to kind of, you know, work out the, you know, you're usually the first hired and entry level and so on and so forth. I was able to go right into a director position because I had already been there for a few years and had gained that experience on the job. And so I think that's really important. The last piece I would say is kind of also building on Dr. Lewis in that get your tribe together. This is no joke. I think most of us probably wouldn't do this if we really knew how much it took. Right? There are moments where it is dark and it is deep and you wonder, did I make the right decision? And you're gonna need to have those people that can pull you out of that can wrap around you, that can support you and anchor and ground you. Whether it's, you know, a family member or your partner that's like, hey, I need you to wash these dishes. Like, or, you know, I have people telling me like, you think you centered or not, that doesn't mean you don't have to clean the bathroom, right? So those types of things to ground you, but also when you need them to have your back, because you're going to be like in deep writing mode. I used to work all day and then I come home and eat and I'd write all through the night and do it all over again. And that's when I had to sit down with my partner and be like, hey, so support looks like this. It doesn't mean you just disappear because you want to leave me alone. It means that you may cook me a meal, you may bring it to me, you may pick up the laundry. Those types of things. Get really specific about what you're going to need. And there was a book, I don't know if it's still in print because, you know, it's been forever since I've been in grad school. It was called Writing the Winning Dissertation. And there's a chapter in there that helps you have that conversation with your partner or, you know, whoever you are close with and depending on. And so I think those are some really important tips that got me through it.
I know we're 2 minutes from the 1 o'clock hour and I'm looking at Centari here. I don't know if you want the group to take questions or do you want us to give closure here? Yay or nay?
Either way, I know our next session starts at 1:15, but I also want to be cognizant of the fact that people might have to leave at 1. So
Sure.
If we have
Well, maybe we can get 1 or 2 questions if our panelists have enough time. I would say I'd still like to keep us closer to the 1 o'clock hour, so we keep it relatively short. But before we go to questions, let's give a warm applause and thank you to our panelists because you guys were fantastic. So I can't thank you enough. Is there a question? And I want to thank, I saw some comments from Katrina Hassan Hamilton and Fred Smith. I want to thank you guys for and Lori West. You guys were great in terms of your contributions. Fred gave me a whole reading list and so I'm looking forward to reading it. So is there a question or two from the audience that the panelists can answer?
Hey, Dr. Span, I'd just like to say in that reading list, I'd like to share with everyone else in this, and back to what the senator was talking about, decolonizing. And there's a book by Linda Thowell Smith that talks about decolonizing methodologies. And it's a pretty old book, so some of you may know it already. But if you don't, please add this to your library.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
All right, I'm trying to learn the educator pause on Zoom. How much time do you give someone before you interject? I still haven't quite got the gist of it yet. Katrina, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I do, Dr. Span. First off, thank you so much for this panel. This was amazing. And it's just, it's so energetic to see that we have UIUC alum who are out there doing amazing things. So thank you very much for this. My question is, because this is a graduate program and, you know, some of us may be a little bit more seasoned than others, are you ever too old to be a faculty? That's my question. When folks are looking for, you know, faculty positions like, you know, Dr. Williams and others, is there like, are you looking for people who are coming out and who are also young? You know, so that's my question, Dr. Span.
I can take that one. The short answer to that is no. You're not too old. There's no one that's too old to be a faculty member. That diversity of experiences is key. So someone, I think they're looked at differently as well. So if you're coming out of your PhD program and a green PhD member, then we look at that to see your potential and being able to be successful. If you're one who is a bit more veteran in the field, we look at the diversity of experiences that you have had. And sometimes the diversity of those experiences are held really strong because there may be a strong K-12 history that you're bringing that can help our students get into these positions that they like to go into, whether that be in counseling, in psychology, or at leadership.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Thank you again, Dr. Span and everyone.
Hey, can I tell a story about Dr. Page? I don't know if Page is still there, but he taught the philosophy of ed, and man, I thoroughly enjoyed that class. And a lot of it was because he was really able to draw upon his variety of experiences. I mean, he was like an engineer, he was a truck driver, he was an educator. I mean, he was and a philosopher that would blow your mind. I mean, I came out of there not knowing left or right. I'm like, is it really left? Am I sure that it's left? How do I know that I know that I know that it's left? and I really appreciated that. And you know, he was a older adult at the time when I encountered him. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, in his trajectory, he came on later in life into the faculty space. And so I think that there is something to be said about, you know, being more seasoned, mature, lived experience, collections, all of that. I think it really aids in the educational dynamics in space.
Dr. Page was amazing, and most truck drivers do become faculty later in life, just so we're clear on that. All right, well, with that said, why don't we once again thank our panelists. Beyond grateful for your time and consideration and wisdom. And we can't thank you enough. And I cannot wait for the day that we, whatever our next normal is, I can't wait for the day for us to reconvene in person so we can laugh and joke and share these joyous thoughts and memories going forward. So with that, until that day comes, continue to stay healthy, stay safe, and stay positive. And I look forward to our future engagements together. Thank you again, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Take care.
Thank you all.